Welcome to the broadcast, everybody. On this Monday, the 14th of October, just 2 months to Christmas, more or less, you know. 2 months, and they're already there, my dear. Let alone the months flicking on by in the chapters of this book called Life. The years just flick on by, don't they, my dear? With not a care or regard for our concerns. It just keeps on flowing. Rather terrifying, but exhilarating too. A viewer requested a signed photograph of me. Are they mad? I hear you cry. Well, they also offered to pay a rather substantial amount for a signed photograph of me, you know, in the 3-figure range, which I think is quite a significant amount for me. Well, I politely declined, of course. This has been requested many times over the year for signed photographs or autographs to be sent out in the post. I haven't indulged it before. I don't understand why anybody would want such a thing to begin with, my little doctor's scrawl. And, you know, I wouldn't get into the habit of doing such a thing, but I mention this because I am only considering, the possibility of sending out a little token, a gesture of regards in that sort of vein, which I would post out for a modest fee, nothing silly, if there is any demand for it. And I'm not expecting much demand for it, and I'm making no promises. You know, the thought only occurred to me as I read out this comment. But if it is something that you might like in the future, then would you please leave a pear emoji within your comment as you make the comment, if you're able to leave emojis, then I can sort of gauge if there is any interest in such a thing to be sent out. I mean, I know it's rather vulgar, my dear, and a little pretentious, but this is me. What do you expect? I am vulgar and pretentious, so suck it up. Now, we've had a few high-octane looks in recent videos, a lot of glamour and some punchy videos recently, haven't we? But today there aren't going to be too many bells and whistles. For one thing, I haven't got the time later to be editing for a very long time, but I want to keep the vibe a little more low voltage today for those who appreciate a slightly more low voltage broadcast. I like to mix it up here, you know. But I shall be holding forth on kingship and Commonwealth realms and beyond, subjects and citizens, and of course a few basketeers. We will kick off with sovereignty. At Craithie Kirk for Sunday service, where the king was at the wheel, in a light sage green number, with his senior equerry, Johnny Thompson, in the rear. His Majesty was met by the King's Guard, who lined the entranceway to the ancient church, which is steeped in royal history, and His Majesty waved to admirers and the peasants and the paupers alike. He's gearing up for Australia, and I would also like to ask for the input from our many Australian basketeers and viewers. G'day. G'day to all of you, who always make a fantastic contribution to this broadcast. Catherine Davidson says, River, here in Australia, our grovelling left-wing media are proclaiming that certain high-profile Australians and premiers from other states are declining invitations to meet with King Charles and Queen Camilla, as some are staunchly sticking to their Republican guns, and the premiers are ticked off that King Charles isn't visiting their state. They're of course entitled to their opinion, but how petty. Well, indeed, Catherine Davidson, because King Charles will embark on his 17th visit to Australia this week, which is officially the Commonwealth of Australia. That is the full official name of the country, not just Australia, the Commonwealth of Australia. And several politicians have notified the king that they are too busy to attend his reception in Canberra next Monday. All 6 of the state premiers, all 6 of them, have rung in their apologies if they bother to apologise. King Charles is the first British king to visit Australia, the first British king ever. King Charles also lived in Australia for 6 months when he was a young prince. These 6 state premiers are from Victoria. Jacinta Allen from Victoria, who said that she's going to be at a cabinet meeting, and her deputy also declined. And another secretary of theirs was going to attend in their place. Then it came round to Queensland with Stephen Miles, who said that he's busy with his election campaigning. In Tasmania, Jeremy Rockcliffe says he's on a US trade mission. That's his excuse. In South Australia and New South Wales, Peter Malinauskas, Peter Malinauskas and Chris Minns have also said that they are sorry, but they're at a cabinet meeting and can't attend. And in Western Australia, Roger Cook has other commitments. The mind boggles Roger Cook, doesn't it? I wonder what Captain Cook would have thought about that. As you say, Catherine Donaldson, they're of course entitled to their own opinion, and that is my main message. They absolutely are entitled to their own opinion. Indeed, they have the luxury of expressing their own opinion under a constitutional monarchy, a democracy. That is why they are entitled to their own opinion. As we all know, historical colonisation of hundreds of years ago is deeply unfashionable at this moment in time, in this woke world, this crown world, but one wonders where these representatives of Victoria and so-called Queensland and their ancestors and their progeny would have ended up or will end up without that colonisation. That's the quiz. Would Australia have been under the French or the Dutch or possibly the Portuguese? Actually, Tasmania, one of those 6 states, was named for a Dutchman. It was named for Abel Janssen Tasman. In 1642, he was the first European to discover the island. And John Howard, who was the second longest serving Prime Minister of Australia, thought that colonisation was the luckiest thing that happened to Australia. Isn't that something? Not that they were perfect by any means, but they were infinitely more successful and beneficent colonisers than other European countries. Well, the Aboriginal peoples and the Torres Strait Islanders might not feel quite so lucky and might not agree in that regard, and I, for one, can absolutely understand why. But it's no secret that regardless of their political persuasions and convictions, many of these politicians want to appeal to the younger generations that are coming up, and we have to surrender to the fact that we have enjoyed the Western embrace of the Anglosphere for many a decade, which has been a comfort to so many for so many generations. The Anglosphere, the English-speaking nations, the language, the lingua franca, which was exported from the clod of the earth of this tiny but great island on which this purple throne sits and supports my pert posterior. The passage of time has brought in some nations mass immigration at an appalling speed, so identities have been and are being diluted, patriotism has shifted, individual identities of various groups are now trumping or superseding one national symbol. So it's only natural that the bonds that the world, the Western world and the Anglosphere once knew are weakened, even as we are told in no uncertain terms that diversity is our strength. Another member of the Commonwealth, another whose head of state is King Charles, is Canada, and Canada is said to have been more English than England just a few decades ago. Really, and that's probably why I liked it so much when I went there. But the elders, this is among the elders, really, the elder community of Canada. It hasn't trickled down so much to the new generations coming through, and the elders are dying out who had such fond affection. I've told you before of my visits to Canada, a thoroughly modern country, but it was one of the few places that I've been to outside of various establishments in London or community halls around the shires where there were actually portraits of the Queen in the living quarters of many of the older generations there, which was so lovely to see. It really was, but great pride, which is very bonding in a country. But when it comes to republicanism, I fully support those in Australia who want a republic. You know, I support their right to want it and to vote against monarchy and all this thing. If they want a new identity, I support their right to that view thoroughly. And if any of these 6 politicians, these state premiers, hold those views, then that's all very well and good. But my objection to all of this, and the fact that they have rejected an invitation to come and meet with the King, is that at this moment in time, the Commonwealth of Australia remains a constitutional monarchy. And King Charles remains head of state, and he remains King of Australia. Do you hear this, state premiers? Do you actually hear this? He is your king, whether you like it or not. Whether you like it or not, he is the King of Australia. And he is King of Australia not by diktat, not by force, but by democratic vote. So bear that in mind. By democratic vote, by referendums, or referenda if you happen to prefer the more antiquated way, which I actually do. Until such time that that fact is dislodged by popular vote, then these state premiers should behave as elected representatives are expected to behave. In my view, knowing what I've been furnished with at this moment in time, extraordinarily bad form. Bad form, which surprises me in Australia. This is the country of the fair go. Fair go, mate. Fair dinkum? And I know that many of my Australian fruits will actually be appalled by this incivility. You know, he's head of state and king whether you like it or not, and this is called civility, which is to be expected of you. It is called civility, it is called graciousness. And traditionally, it is everything that Australia has stood for in the past. The fair go. A spokesperson for the Monarchists' League of Australia said that all premiers and ministers have sworn allegiance to our monarch, Charles III, and it's a monumental insult that they now spit in his hand, extended in friendship. This is a historic opportunity to unite Australia, to focus on charitable work and to give back to communities. Yet our immature politicians are clearly choosing to play politics. This is not about what may or may not happen in the future, and I cannot see how a constitutional monarchy will last much longer. Anyway, you know, I can't really envisage how. Although recent polling demonstrates that in fact only 1 in 3 Australians were of the view that Australia should become a republic in this recent snapshot. And as for Charles, on a personal level, he has an affection for Australia, which he's stated on many occasions, but he has always said that it is a matter for the Australian public to decide, and he made remarks to that effect in a recent letter to the Australian Republican movement, who wrote to him asking to meet with him, which he kindly declined. But a letter was passed on from an aide to the King, Dr. Nathan Ross, who wrote, "His Majesty as a constitutional monarch acts on the advice of his ministers, and whether Australia becomes a republic is therefore a matter for the Australian public to decide. In order for Australia to pass a referendum and become a republic, there are 2 hurdles. They require more than 50% of Australia to vote in favour of a republic, and also they must win support in a majority of states. And if, for example, 3 states voted in support of republicanism and 3 states opposed it, then the referendum would still fail, even if more than 50% voted in favour. So there are a couple of hurdles. And I have compassion, actually a great deal of compassion, for those who are in favour of republicanism. I wouldn't want to live under a constitution that I don't have faith in or that I am not enthusiastic about. I happen to be very enthusiastic and delighted to live under a constitutional monarchy. I wouldn't have it any other way. Any other way. But that is why I have great compassion for those who would, who would choose to. But it is the petty manner that they wrongly assume that our kings and our queens and as individuals are so pressed about it. They really think that King Charles is so pressed about it, and it has been likened to the threat of taking a little toy away from a child, as Charles has said himself. And I'll throw in a couple of clips here and there from a rather interesting piece from 1994, A Current Affair, which is available on YouTube. I shall put the link in the description box in case anyone's curious.
Would you like to be King of Australia?
I think what it is very important to get across about all this, and all as a result of all this debate about a republic or whatever, is that when we, as a family, don't own this place, it doesn't belong, and it's not as if we're making money out of it, is that this extraordinary idea that, you know, you're liable to be denied the great chance to be King of Australia, as if it was, you know, taking a toy away from a spoilt child. But I mean, I could understand everybody desperately, you know, hanging on, well, if you were making money out of this place.
I really enjoyed looking it over it, actually. An hour or two ago, I watched through this interview, and it's interesting to see Charles, you know, a few decades ago, and he starts off a little bit stiff, and then he warms up, and there's humour there. He could be a bit prickly at times, but always with humour.
The taxi driver that I got up here today, he said, which I think every Australian would say, it's a bugger of a job. Your job's a bugger of a job. Is it?
How nice of him to be so sympathetic.
A few illuminating parts, though.
Well, I mean, occasionally I bump into people in the UK or elsewhere, so I wouldn't mind your job. I'd be delighted. Try it any time they like. But like all people's jobs, you'll find that it isn't actually what it appears to be.
And he was asked for his personal feelings about this during the interview, which he manages to more or less dodge without getting too intimate. And his reply is more neutral.
It's up to Australians to decide how they want it to be. It's not up to me to decide. But some people will see advantage in keeping the existing system. Others will see advantages in changing it.
That is civility, you know. That is the behaviour of a public servant. The late Elizabeth signed off your servant Elizabeth, didn't she? Even in her dying years. That is how she saw herself. Your servant, not your ruler, your queen regnant, even though she was. She reigned, but she served, and that was important and is important to Charles. But it doesn't seem to be important to these 6 state premiers. Their duty is to serve the electorate. I adore Australia very much. I've spoken of it highly. I was speaking to a friend of mine who is English, actually, but resides in Melbourne just today. I call her Peach Melba because she's a bit of a Melbourne peach. I love Australia. I've been to Australia. I adore Australians. You know, most of them. But some of these state officials might remind themselves what being a public servant is all about. A little slice of encouraging news, though, with regards to reparations, and I'm pleased to hear that calls for billions in reparations from various nations of the West Indies, such as Barbados, are not up for discussion at the present time at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa next week. The Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who gets on very well with the King by all accounts, and for all appearances' sake, is demanding reparations for slavery and colonialism as part of a new global reset. That's what they call it. How sinister. Doesn't it sound so sinister and macabre, my dears? A global reset. If God Almighty wishes to send the floods for 40 days and 40 nights, with the Waleses and the Sussexes and the Basketeers partnering up, my dear, 2 by 2, then that is a reset that one must surrender and submit to, my dear, with good grace. But all else is not organic. This notion of a great reset is not organic, and that is why it just makes my teeth itch. Our Prime Minister's spokesman, Keir Starmer's spokesman, said, just to be clear, reparations are not on the agenda for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. Technically, the government's position on this has not changed. We do not pay reparations. Well, I do note that this spokesman says technically the position has not changed, so I'd be more comfortable if that word were omitted entirely, because I don't want them dropping that technicality in the future, but that will have to do for the moment. Mia Motley reckons that Barbados is owed 4.9 trillion by former slave-owning nations. 4.9 trillion. Couldn't they have made it up to 5? You'd think they'd round up the number a little, wouldn't you? Do they think they're doing a £4.99 on us? It's not really £5, it's only £4.99. We see you, we see you. Well, Barbados has been cozying up with China, hasn't it? Cozying up with China, and this is a hypocrisy, because they want China's big bucks for their Belt and Roads money. And this is the irony of this quiz, because that money is being taken from China, who are possibly the biggest current users of slavery in their production lines and facilities and their products. We all know what's going on with modern slavery. We all know that it's not something that only existed under the British Empire. It was every other fucking empire in the world, until the British Empire put a stop to it. It was the British Empire who called it out for the first time, even though it still exists in other areas, in other ways, in modern ways. That particular sort of crude slavery was stamped out by the British. But it does still continue, and China is, if not the biggest, certainly up there with the biggest users of slaves to this very day. So where is the logic? Where is the logic, Barbados, in cozying up with them, being very amenable to their funds, while trying to sue us and various other historical slave-owning nations, asking us to cough up to the tune of 5 trillion, or whatever it is. Apache 5705 said, "The monarch doesn't have subjects anymore. You should know this." I guess I'd mentioned in a previous broadcast that we are subjects of the king. I can't remember the context. Well, it made me question what I know, my dear, because I'm no expert on the subject. So I can only offer you my understanding and why I refer to myself as a subject, and why, whether right or wrong, I will continue to refer to myself as a subject. And of course there has been a shift from subject to citizen over the last few centuries, but grey areas do remain. A subject is someone who is under the dominion of a monarch, with no say in how they are treated. A citizen has rights, and some of those citizens of ancient Greece and Rome took part in government, and citizens have the right to be heard. Following the Norman conquest in 1066, there was a sea of change, and in 1215 King John signed the Magna Carta, which conceded that the king's power was not absolute. And that was the first time that the rights of an individual appeared in British law at all. And these ideas were developed over the next 800 years, and matters escalated in the past couple of 100 years, culminating in universal suffrage. And then there was a gradual increase in duties upon rulers and rights for the people, subject to citizen. However, the transfer of power is not absolute, because society only functions if citizens agree to be subject to laws made in their name. Do you see? So we surrender our right to be totally and absolutely free in return for the protection that is provided by our society. As the empire dismantled last century, rights and duties flowed from Parliament in the name of the monarch. Remember, it's His Majesty's government, creating the concept of citizenship, although there is no formal document that declares or crystallises such a change, because our constitution is not written. It is an ever living breathing, growing organism. My understanding, and as I say, I am not in any way some expert of history or a constitutional expert whatsoever, so you might know more than me, but my understanding is that we remain subjects in legalese, in the areas of law, as the sweep of history comes along and finds that we are citizens, albeit in constitutionally different ways to other nations. You know, the Magna Carta that I mentioned was used as the model for American law, of course, so it is hugely influential to this day over the world. And in fact, the founding fathers of America used the Magna Carta, but they brought it back to the rights emanating from God rather than from man, the unalienable rights that they are termed, you know, endowed by their creator. So the matter twists and turns depending on the nation and the interpretation, etc. But for myself alone, just as I am English before British, but both, I am also both subject and citizen. The government of this land is a democratic government, but it is also His Majesty's government. I am a citizen of a country and a subject of sovereignty. The two work together, and they work together very well in my estimation. So may never the two be torn asunder. I am the subject of my sovereign, King Charles III, a proud subject, and God forbid that I ever become the subject of a politician, such as these six. Let's wrap things up with a little poem, my dears. A viewer called Girl of the Valley brought this poem to my attention. Nothing gold can stay. I presume it was in reference to the sort of goldy coloured, champagne coloured number that I was wearing in the previous broadcast. I'm not sure. But I rather liked it, and it seems to be a meditation on the transience of nature, the transience of everything we've talked about today, the shifting change of the world. Nothing is certain except for change. And the seasons that we always discuss here on the broadcast. The turn of the season. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. And that includes me, my dear, so thank you for spending a golden moment with me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next broadcast. If you'd like to fill my pot with gold, then you will find it at the end of the rainbow in my tip jar in the description box below. See you next time, my dears. Ta-ra and toodle pip.